If you close your eyes and think about the brand Texas Instruments, what do you see? I think for most of us, the answer is a calculator. Now, if you hate maths, I have good news for you. I'm not going to talk about calculators. It turns out that Texas Instruments makes most of its money from microcontrollers. And in specific, I'm going to talk about this MSP430 line of microcontrollers, which is especially used in these low power settings. So think about, for example, key fobs for your car or smart meters. In 2014, Texas Instruments released a new edition of this microcontroller. This is just jam-packed with security features. So for example, it has physical protections to prevent the extraction of the memory from the device. It has a memory protection unit, and it has what is the focus of this talk, Intellectual Property Encapsulation, or IPE for short. I will start with explaining what IPE does. This rectangle represents the memory map of the device. And what IPE does is it adds two hardware registers to the device that can demarcate part of this memory as part of this encapsulated region. So the bottom and the top say this is the boundaries of the encapsulated region. And in this region, you can put both code and data. And the idea behind the protection is that code from inside the region can access data inside the region, but no code from outside the region is allowed to read or write either the data or the code inside the region. In addition, there's also protections from the debugger and direct memory access. So these are also not allowed to access the data or the code inside the protected region. So maybe a few of you are now thinking, well, this looks a lot like a trusted execution environment, and that's also what we thought. So it looks a bit similar to Intel SGX or ARM Trust Zone, but on this very low-end embedded device. So we thought this is an interesting target for a security evaluation. So we took a lot of the insight that has been gathered over the years in the literature about these TEs and attacks on them, and we tried to apply this to this device. This table contains the summary of our results. So all the attacks that you see highlighted are the successful attacks that we managed to demonstrate on the device. We only focused on software-based attacks, so there's still a lot of other literature that could be explored for these devices. But already you can see that, for example, there are a surprising number of side channels that are applicable to leak some information from this protected region, the IPE region. For example, there's a small cache on the device, and just like any other cache, this just leaks information. But more importantly, there are also these architectural attacks that enable a more direct leakage or corruption of the data or the code inside the device. Here I want to give a small shout out to another paper that was presented at Wood a couple days ago called RIP Encapsulation, that in parallel to us really took a deep dive into these two primitives. So after this session, and once you're done reading our paper, I also invite you to check out this paper. But for this talk, I'm going to focus on this controlled call corruption, because this is a new primitive that we think hasn't been demonstrated before on any other device. When I talk about call corruption, the call here refers to the call assembly instruction. So I will first explain what this assembly instruction does. Imagine that you're writing code in your favorite programming language, C. If you're an advanced programmer, you're probably using these things called functions. And when you perform a function call in the translated assembly, your second favorite programming language, this will be represented by this call assembly instruction. So at least on MSP430, there's a dedicated instruction for calling functions. And this instruction does two things. It redirects the control flow to the function that you want to call. So this is not very surprising. In fact, it would be more surprising if it didn't do this. But it also does a second thing, which is it writes the return address onto the stack. And the return address is just the address of the instruction that follows the call, so that once you're done executing the function that you called, you know the CPU knows where it needs to continue the execution. And the precise location where this return address is written to on the stack is determined by the value of this hardware register, the stack pointer. And as an attacker, we can override this stack pointer when we are executing code from outside the IPE region. So at this point, we put on our attacker hat and we start thinking, is there some kind of edge case here that we could try to exploit? So this indirect write, the writing of the return address, maybe this is handled differently than the more direct writes or reads. that you can also perform from attacker code. So what do? We just override the stack pointer register to point inside the protected IP region, and then we again execute our call instruction from unprotected code. And what we hope is that the CPU is not going to perform the usual access control check, and we can override data inside this IP region. What actually happens is that the CPU refuses this write, so it's working as intended. Okay, at this point, we put on our second attacker hat, and we start thinking, is there an edge case to the edge case that we could try to exploit? And what we do is, instead of calling any old function on the device, what happens if we call a function inside the IP region? So obviously this should be allowed, because if we cannot call codes in the IP region, then what's the purpose of putting code inside? So this is all fine. We again override the stack pointer to point inside the IP region. We call a function inside the IP region. And what do you know? This actually works. So you can overwrite a location inside the IP region using this attack primitive. Okay, great, but what does this actually give us? Well, we can just set our stack pointer to some random value inside the protected region and hope that we override some code that will corrupt the application, it will make it crash, it will make it do undefined behavior, whatever. You can do that, but you can be a lot more smart about this. So for example, if you know that there's some useful secret data inside the region, you can change the stack pointer to point to this specific value. And then when you do the attack, you override this with the return address, and you know what the return address is going to be, because it just depends on where you put your attacking call instruction. So at this point, you can override, for example, an encryption key with a return address, a known value. And of course, if then the IP performs some encryption and puts out that data, then it's trivial to decrypt because you know the encryption key. You can go even deeper, and you can insert what's called the universal read gadget. And what I mean with the universal read gadget is an instruction that can leak arbitrary memory from inside the IP region. So this is worth zooming into a bit more. So when we overwrite some memory with the return address, what we really insert is just a 16-bit value, a memory address that represents the next instruction after the call. But it turns out that assembly instructions in MSP430 are also encoded in 16 bits. So if we choose the value of the return address carefully, that can actually represent a valid assembly instruction. So that means that if you choose a return address that represents, for example, a move instruction that just moves memory from inside the IP region outside, then this way, with this attack primitive, you can insert an instruction that just leaks the entire IP memory. And then when you execute the IP code with this corrupted instruction inside, it will just do this for you. Okay, that's pretty smart. You can actually be even more smart because inside this IP region, there's a configuration structure that also stores the boundaries of the IP region. And the reason for this is that on the device reset, this protected configuration structure is going to be evaluated, and this can allow the IP region itself to change its boundaries. So for example, if it needs more memory, it can just expand the size of the protected region. But of course, with this primitive, we can now override this struct, and we can just completely remove the protection so that after a device reset, there's no more protection. You can just read out all the memory that was meant to be protected. Okay, this looks pretty bad. Maybe you're asking, okay, precisely how bad is this attack? The answer is 7.1. So TI, the security team at TI released this advisory where they assigned this attack a CVSS score of 7.1. And they also summarized some of the protections or mitigations that we also describe in our paper. So what are these mitigations? Well, in the paper, we theorize that this is probably a time of check, time of use, time of vulnerability. And you can probably fix this in hardware fairly easily, but of course, only TI can do this because it's a closed-sourced commercial design. So instead, we developed a software framework that also mitigates this attack. It's kind of a stopgap solution until the updated microcontrollers can come out. This framework is made up of a source-to-source translation of C code. It also has some handwritten assembly stubs, some generated assembly stubs, and some C helper functions. And together, these repurpose the memory protection unit to provide an additional layer of security on this IPE region. And this way, it can actually reinstate the security guarantees that were meant to be applied to the IPE region and protect against all the architectural attack primitives, including this controlled corruption. Of course, because this is a software-only solution, there are a few limitations. For example, we cannot guarantee these protections with the same attacker model in mind. If the attacker has access to the physical device and has these physical methods, for example, if the attacker can control the debugger unit, through that, they can actually extract the memory. And also, because we use the MPU to provide these guarantees, the MPU can only be reconfigured on a device reset. So every time we do a context switch from unprotected to protected code, we have to reset the device. And this adds a non-deterministic amount of overhead. To summarize, we conducted a security analysis of TI-IPE. We found a number of vulnerabilities, including a novel vulnerability, the controlled call corruption, but also we reproduced a lot of existing vulnerabilities and attacks from the TE literature. And these allow the complete leakage and corruption of protected code and data inside the IPE region. We also wrote this mitigation framework that can kind of restore these security guarantees. And I invite you to check out the paper for a lot more details and performance evaluation and all the case study attacks that we performed. And you can also go to this repository to find a lot of attack code in your 2 favorite programming languages. Thank you.